The reason XRP creates so much debate is because people are arguing from completely different perspectives and assumptions about the future financial system. Some people think stablecoins win everything. Some people think XRP becomes global liquidity infrastructure. And the truth is, no one actually knows yet. But I do think the bigger story is not really crypto. It is the fact that the entire financial system is starting to evolve towards tokenization, faster settlements, and programmed liquidity. So this is just my own opinion. This is not financial advice, not investment advice. I could be completely wrong. I'm just trying to think through this logically, from an infrastructure, liquidity, and incentives perspective. So don't make financial decisions based off this video. To answer these questions, I thought it'd be helpful to ask ChatGPT. So let's see what he has to say. Is XRP solving a real problem? Or are stablecoins making XRP unnecessary?
Honestly, I think this is the entire XRP debate in one question. Because XRP supporters and XRP critics are almost talking about two different worlds. The anti-XRP argument is, why would institutions use a volatile asset when stablecoins already exist? And honestly, that's a valid question. Stablecoins already solve stable value, dollar liquidity, easier accounting, institutional familiarity.
A good question. Why would institutions use a volatile asset when they can use stablecoins that are very stable? That already exists. Stablecoins do solve a lot of important problems. Fast transactions, stable value, and many more. So the question is, where does XRP fit in? Maybe XRP doesn't replace money. Maybe XRP becomes a bridge between a fragmented system.
Dollar stablecoin based, XRP's role becomes less obvious. But the XRP argument is different. The XRP thesis is not really. XRP replaces money. The stronger thesis is XRP becomes a neutral bridge between fragmented systems, because the future financial system may become more fragmented, not less. You could have stablecoins, CBDCs, tokenized assets, private institutional ledgers, national digital currencies, different compliance systems all operating at the same time. And if liquidity becomes fragmented across all these systems, then interoperability becomes extremely valuable. That's where XRP potentially has an edge. Not as money itself, but as a liquidity coordination layer, especially for cross-border settlement where neither side wants exposure to the other country's currency. Now, the biggest unresolved issue is this. Will institutions actually tolerate exposure to a volatile bridge asset, or will stablecoins and private liquidity systems become efficient enough that XRP becomes unnecessary? That's still the central question. But I think people oversimplify XRP when they frame it as, will XRP replace banks? That's probably the wrong framework entirely. The more interesting question is whether global finance eventually needs neutral liquidity bridges between increasingly fragmented systems. There probably isn't one exact perfect XRP market cap. The real answer is, the more value flowing through the system, the more liquidity depth XRP would need to operate efficiently at scale. Because what institutions care about is low slippage, deep order books, execution quality, stability, the ability to move very large amounts of capital without impacting price. A tiny market cap asset can't efficiently absorb massive global liquidity flows. That's why XRP supporters often argue that a higher valuation is actually necessary for XRP to function as global liquidity infrastructure. For example, if banks were moving billions of dollars through XRP daily, a shallow market would create volatility, slippage, poor execution, instability. But as liquidity deepens, volatility can decrease, spreads tighten, larger transfers become easier, institutions gain confidence using it. Now this is where it gets interesting. People think high XRP price is just moon boy speculation. But in a liquidity network, higher valuation can theoretically improve the network's operational efficiency, because each unit of XRP can absorb more value transfer with less market disruption. That's the core logic behind the high-value bridge asset thesis. Now, realistically, if XRP were truly being used at major institutional scale globally, people arguing for multi-trillion-dollar market caps are usually arguing from that liquidity depth perspective, not just price go up. They're basically saying global liquidity infrastructure would require enormous liquidity pools to function smoothly. The real question is whether institutions will ever use XRP deeply enough for that level of liquidity demand to actually happen. That's still the unresolved part.
It's the part of the XRP thesis that's actually very interesting. Not that XRP will replace all money narrative, the idea of a neutral bridge between fragmented systems. Stablecoins, CBDCs, tokenized assets, private ledgers, different national systems, the interoperability becomes a real problem. And that neutral liquidity layer starts making more logical sense, especially because countries and institutions may not want to rely entirely on another country's currency or closed financial system. That's where the infrastructure argument for XRP becomes much stronger than the typical hype narrative most people focus on. I think this is where the XRP conversation gets really interesting, because you hear XRP holders talk about $1 trillion market caps, and they immediately assume this is unrealistic market caps and unrealistic hype. But the actual infrastructure argument is more compelling than that. If XRP was being used by large-scale liquidity, then liquidity depth becomes extremely important. For example, if XRP has roughly a $500 billion market cap, the price would be between $8 and $9 roughly. At a $1 trillion market cap, the price would be roughly $18 or $19. And a $5 trillion market cap, XRP's price would be between $85 and $90. Let that sink in. And a $10 trillion market cap, XRP's price would be $170 to $180. Now, honestly, those prices sound insane. But XRP supporters argue that if XRP becomes global liquidity infrastructure, higher valuations could actually improve the network. Why? Because institutions care about low slippage, deep liquidity, execution quality, and stability. If XRP had a small market cap, moving billions of dollars through the network, it could create major market impact, high slippage, and poor execution. But if XRP had trillions of dollars liquidity depth, then massive transactions could happen with less disruption. And then Ripple's holdings becomes very important as well, because Ripple controls a massive amounts of XRP. So their incentives become connected to more liquidity, more adoption, and more infrastructure. Expanding the use case, more liquidity, more adoption, more infrastructure, and expanding use case. Deeper liquidity can increase the usefulness of the network. Now, whether the institutions ever adopt XRP deeply enough for those valuations to make sense, that's the big unanswered question. But I think the infrastructure logic is much more interesting than XRP to the moon conversation.